Today, our guest is Rodney Smith, Athens County Sheriff, and I, as a retired historian, are going to ask Rodney, or he can ask me rather, any questions about the drug opioid addiction crisis that he may have on the top of his agenda right now. You want to ask me any questions? Okay. Then I will have my answer as we have to look at the stable religions of Catholicism, Judaism, and Protestantism, which gave standards of drug and alcohol addiction when I was a boy in 1930 when I was born, and I became of age in 1948 and knew that there were religious debates. And looking at the Old Testament, there were 39 books in the Old Testament, and the New Testament has 27 books. And the Genesis was the oldest book in the Bible, and it was accepted by the Jews and the Christians as the Word of God. But from the point of view of a history, the Bible did not have dates. And this Old Testament was written over the period from 1750 BC to 1200 BC. At that time, the Hebrews were a tribe of people who wandered out of the land of Egypt, and Moses, the chief of the tribe, could neither read nor write, and he didn't have a calendar. So Moses supposedly wandered in the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years, from about 1250 BC to 1210 BC. And when he died, Joshua became the head of the tribe, and he invaded the land of Canaan, which was the holy city of Jerusalem before the Jews and the Canaanites ever got there. Nobody knows how old Jerusalem is. So anyway, one of the judges was named Saul, and he ruled the judges before they had a king. And King David then, we have real dates now, King David was born about 1010 BC and died in 970 BC. And King Solomon, the next most powerful king, was born in 970 BC and died in 431 BC. After that, the kingdom of the Jews was split into the Judean kingdom and the Israelite kingdom, and the Jews were very poor politicians, but they had a very understanding religion. So the Israelites were conquered by many ancient empires, and they were conquered by the ancient Greeks, and then the Romans conquered both the Greeks and the Jews, and the Roman Empire, the Roman emperor, destroyed the holy city of Jerusalem in 70 AD after Jesus Christ. So there were 27 books in the Protestant Bible, 12 extra books in the Orthodox and Catholic Bible, and the Jewish Bible dated, or the Jewish civilization dated the birth of Christ from 29 BC to 31 AD, because the so-called zero calendar was inaccurate because they didn't have telescopes. So Jesus, according to telescopes, was born actually in 29 BC and died in 31 AD. St. Paul was prominent in forming the Christian religion, and he died in 65 AD, and then the Roman Empire destroyed the Jewish city of Jerusalem. So getting to the Ten Commandments then, the Genesis was written in prehistoric times, and it was written down for the first time in 1030 to 1010 BC. And as I say, Moses was a chief who wandered and was illiterate, and then King David then became a clear king in 1030 BC and to 1010 BC. Solomon was from 970 BC to 936. So then the religious kingdom split into two, and in 322 AD, the successors of Alexander the Great conquered Israel and the Christian and Muslim rulers, and they handed that Egypt was founded by Alexander the Great, an Egyptian, and we have a new capital of the Christian religions. So now, getting back to the United States, in 1789, when the American Constitution was formed, we had Catholics, Jews, and Protestants, and Roman Catholic John F. Kennedy was the first Catholic to be elected in 1960. Now, the Jews said that drunkenness was the sin, not drinking wine itself. So the Jewish temple used to celebrate a temperance by drinking wine in the temple. And then after the Romans destroyed Israel, the Muslims conquered, the Arabs conquered that. And so the Jews then were subject of either Christian kings or Arab caliphates. So my major source for drugs and alcohol came from Ohio State University professor who died this year, and his name was John Burnham. And I have his book here called Bad Habits. Now, bad habits used to be called venial sins when I was a kid. But because he is a historian of science and religion, he says the bad habits are drinking, smoking, taking psychoactive drugs, gambling, sexual misbehavior, and swearing. Okay? So that is the title of the book, and that is a major source of what I shall speak about, if you don't have any questions at this point.
I do not.
Good? Okay, well, let's go forward then. I agree with Burnham. And Burnham says that drinking is the worst habit. And alcoholism is addiction, is drug addiction. Smoking, he says, is also addictive, and we have nicotine addiction. And the psychoactive drugs are opium, cocaine, and heroin was the most serious drug when I was a boy. They had hypodermic needles, and these drugs have become more and more toxic with opiates. And this journal talks about the new species of madness and talks about the expansion of drug addiction, and we can get to that if we have time, but we'll keep going forward then. Okay? Well, that's all I'll say about this book, and we'll go in here to this book. This is called The Species of Madness, Drugs. And he talks about 4 or 5 books here, and this is a guy who's totally tuned out on opioids. This is photographed as 1996, and you don't have any questions or comments at this point?
Well, drug addiction and alcohol addiction, they're all addictions, and
Good.
You know, it's somebody or some person that needs help on these addictions. So opioids, heroin, things like that is very addictive, and that's one of the biggest problems we have in Athens County. So we do a lot of things to help people with those addictions. I mean, we have Narcan in our cruisers.
Good.
Which Narcan is a very safe medicine. It can reverse those brain receptors. If somebody overdoses on heroin or an opioid, which is Oxycontin or Percocets, it's a nasal spray. We can put it in our cruiser, and we could administer that, and we've done it a few times, which...
That's a short-term relief.
It's a short... Well, what it is, your brain receptors tell you to stop breathing.
Yeah.
When you overdose on heroin.
Yeah.
So Narcan, what that does is it reverses those brain receptors and tells you to start breathing.
Good.
So we've used it a few times. It's become very effective, and we've actually saved a few lives with our first responders, our deputies,
Okay.
and we can help out until the emergency squad gets there. There's also shots called Vivitrol.
Good.
Which is normally court-ordered, and if somebody has administered a shot of cortisol, it basically takes away the high of the heroin or opiates.
Good.
So there's other drugs such as cocaine and methamphetamines that really has no effect on, but still, if you work on the addiction, you need to also go through counseling and work on the drug addictions to get successfully over, whether it be alcohol addictions, you got the AA, or drug addictions. There's counseling, there's shots, there's medication that can help
Wonderful.
you through this process.
Wonderful. That's very informative. But I guess I'm mainly interested, and I think John Burnham is mainly interested, in prevention.
Sure.
An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we're very big on, and we believe this very strongly, that is, if you can start when someone's very young,
Right.
and you start with them before they ever experiment with drugs, and
Right.
and that's why we have a DARE officer such as Jimmy Childs, and we try to educate, our whole office tries to educate the younger people.
Right.
So if we can get them to never experiment with drugs, and statistically, the older they get, the less likelihood they'll ever experiment
Yeah.
with drugs.
Now-
So we have education, we have enforcement, and we have treatment.
Right.
So our first line of defense is really education, which we reach out to the young people, and hopefully if we can reach some of them through our education process and they never try drugs, that's, when you never start it, that's the best case scenario.
Now, I would like to say that I and my father were never drunk in their lives.
Well, that's great.
Now, my mother was an absolute teetotaler. Now, my father was drafted in the First World War, and he got into drinking brandy, but he never got drunk because the French Army, the British Army, and the Russian Army, everybody wanted to have sober people fighting in the war. Now, they may give him a shot of whiskey one day to get over the top, but they couldn't have alcohol in the barracks. Now, on the Navy, the British Navy, they had rum, and they gave every sailor a rum drink, but it was rationed before they went into battle. That's the old-time religion.
Well, sometimes I'm sure that helped. But, you know...
Prevention is absolutely necessary.
Exactly. And every human being is different. Some people have addictive personalities, and some people, you know, they can experiment with drugs and move on and not get addicted. But some people, it's just that one time.
Right.
It's that one time they take that drug, and they're hooked, and it's a big, long...
Well, this is a problem of the American Indians. You see, the Europeans were kind of immune to alcohol because they've been drinking it for thousands of years. Now, the people from Spain to Israel are all wine drinkers, but they drink it with food. They have a religious temperance theory. You very seldom see any drunk. I've lived in Spain for 2 years. You very, very seldom see any drunks on the street. And in Spain, they give kids a little glass of wine, 10 cents. But the bartender says, you do not let them have a second or third or fourth,
Well, that's probably,
or they take their license away.
that's part of their culture.
That's part of their prevention.
Right.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, it's the education process. So apparently that works for them. But I mean, over here, as far as the alcohol and the drugs, that's our first line where we try to educate young people or anyone.
The Northern Europeans, the Irish, the Poles, the Russians, the Germans became beer drinkers and whiskey drinkers, and they could get drunk over the centuries. And the British began the temperance movement before the Americans did. Back in the 1730s, they invented a new drink called gin. And there were people all over London dying in the streets of gin. So then the British government started a temperance movement. And that was passed to the Americans through John Wesley, who was the founder of the Methodist Church, and William Penn, who was an Englishman, who was shipped to the Americans. And the Methodist religion expanded all over the 13 colonies. And the Methodists and the Quakers were the leading temperance group in the United States. And that's how that temperance theory came to America. So George Washington, John Adams, James Madison, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams were light social drinkers who might have had some whiskey at certain celebrations, but you couldn't be drunk in battle.
Oh, right.
So that's prevention.
Right. And that's moderation.
And that's tolerant. That's toleration.
Right.
They could tolerate small drinks in small. Now, alcoholism became a big problem after the 7th president, Andrew Jackson, was elected, because we had the popular vote. And the old restricted suffrage were no longer elitists, okay? So Jackson was our first popular president, in which the popular vote became more important than the electoral vote. So the Southerners and the Northerners were heavy drinkers of one kind or another, okay? And then the temperance movement was founded with prohibition. Otterbein College was a Methodist college. They formed a group called the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And then they introduced prohibition in the United States. In 1740, Maine was the first state to have state prohibition. That's where the term speakeasy came from. And they used to carry a bottle of whiskey down in their cuff like that, see? Well, anyway, prohibition spread from Maine down to Ohio and went out to Kansas, and prohibition expanded from 1740 to 1917. Now, in 1917, the First World War broke out, and Woodrow Wilson got prohibition passed as a national amendment. It was called the 18th Amendment. And it said alcohol is prohibited. And that then was the passage of national prohibition. Well, in 1933, Roosevelt was elected. Now, there was a big argument between the wets and the dries all during that period. Well, Roosevelt said, and he had a lot of drinkers among the Jews and the Catholics, who said, if we repeal prohibition, it'll be good for business. So the 21st Amendment repealed national prohibition. And then you have Al Capone and the mafia and so forth selling drinks, and we had the drinking expansion.
The black market.
Black market, yeah, speakeasies. And that's where we get to this drug addiction problem. Okay? So I guess I'll continue here and cite some of these sources here about species of madness. Got some new data, which means that John Burnham's bad habits has to be expanded because the drugs have become more powerful. So this title says, Species of Madness. Some accounts of lives and brains of addicts, at once diplomats and double agents pursuing the path of self-destruction. So then we have a lot of books here, and we come down here to Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He was a poet in Britain. Have you ever heard of Coleridge?
I'm not.
Okay, Coleridge was the first Englishman who became addicted to opium. And he took opium because it gave him dreams, and he could write novels about China. But then after he became addicted, he said to all of his fellow poets, never become addicted again. And the importation of opium was banned in Britain, and it was considered a Chinese problem. Now, when the British took over China, the Hindus used opium as a narcotic, restricted amount, to put people to sleep. But the Chinese had no, like the American Indians, had no experience. They had no immunity. So the British collected the taxes in opium from India and imported it into China. And China's then became drug addicts smoking opium pipes. And then that drained all of the gold out of China. And the British imported tea and Chinaware, and the Chinese became poorer and poorer and poorer.
Well, one of the things I've seen a lot of here is when people get addicted, especially to opiates or any drugs, sometimes when the addiction is they just want to feel normal. In other words, they get addicted to this drug and they take this drug and they need to get it, so they do things such as steal, they break into buildings or cars because they try to support their habit. And I would equate that if you had a prescription drug that you needed to take every day to feel normal, to feel okay, you would take that prescription drug. What if you didn't have it anymore?
But the prescription drugs are poisoned. These opiates,
well,
you know how that works.
When they take the opiates, it's not a good thing, but they get what they call dope sick, so they take it so they can feel normal again.
Well, the opiates we now get are manufactured by the drugs dealers, the chemists and the chemists.
Well,
they have powerful addicts there, and they export that through corruption to Mexico. And then the Mexicans bring those opiates back to the United States, and they're sold on the black market. So that's why we have an opioid crisis.
Sure. And on the black market is a bad thing. You know,
That's terrible.
It's a drug, but you know, with the Oxycontins and the pain medication, that's prescribed as a good thing. It's a pain
You have
medication.
temporary salvation, but not long-range prevention.
Well, it's just like anything else in moderation, prescribed by a doctor. You know, if they don't oversubscribe
Okay.
the medication,
Okay.
it's a good thing.
So we have an opioid crisis in every state in the United States.
We have an opioid crisis everywhere.
Okay, fine. So I don't know what more you want to say about this, but I can give you more personal experience of relatives of mine
Okay.
who became drunk, became alcoholics, and died young. I had a cousin. I had two cousins. The older cousin followed my family's policy of no drinking or little drinking. And the other cousin got a job with the bank, and she began drinking with her friends. And then she got alcoholism and died at a young age of about 40 years old.
Well, you know,
They couldn't abstain. They couldn't get off it.
it takes a toll on your body, whether it's alcohol
Yeah.
or drugs. Over time, it takes a
Okay.
serious toll on your body.
Yeah. So prevention is worth a pound of cure, and I think you agree that we have an opioid crisis, and you do your duty as a sheriff, and I have my duty as a historian, and John Burnham and this fellow here, the author of this document is called Francis Jano. They are trying to give a long-term Alcoholic Anonymous rehabilitation can sometimes work, but there are many relapses. So do you think we should continue with this, or do you want to hear more sad stories, or do you think we should cut it short? That's up to you.
That's your call.
All right. Well, I'll continue as long as you want to listen. I told you about my cousin, and I had... Hello? We only got halftime. Well, we have halftime. So we can summarize what we've done so far. And I've been talking to the sheriff, and my line is drug prevention, and I have no short-term cures. And I think that we should preach as a society to both Catholics, Protestants, and Jews to take prevention. Now, John Kennedy, elected president, was a good president politically, as far as I'm concerned, but he had drug problems, and he had and alcohol problems, and he was not a very good Christian in his practice. And his sons and his relatives all got into alcohol and drug problems and died relatively young. That's the people who suffer from drug and alcohol addiction. Okay, let's see, what else would I like to say then, if you still want to listen, about how I look at some of the footnotes here, and we'll go down to a statistic here, which struck me as very important. Talking about overdose. This is a citation from a medical doctor. Drug dealer, MD. This drug dealer, who has an MD, gives doses which reach the critical levels, now as many as 65,000 annually, a number who have been which has been doubled to 80% of the world's opioid supply consumed. The United States is the biggest consumer of these drugs because they have the money. So Americans are killing themselves with Oxycontin and overdoses, and there are corrupt doctors who do it for money. Well, these people have to be disbarred.
Well,
my
they're working
opinion.
on legislation to lower the dosage as far as the Oxycontin and the opioids. So I think statistically, if they can lower the dosage if somebody is having being treated for pain, they lower the dosage of what they've been getting, is a better success rate of them getting through their process and not being addicted to drugs. So I think just the fact that they're aware of that, the doctors are, and they're starting to lower the dosage of whatever they prescribe as far as the opiates is being successful. And if they do pass this legislation, it's going to be
It'll be a help, sure.
it'll be a big help for
Right.
the people.
But it has to be enforced.
It has to be enforced, and like you say, if prevention is a pound of cure, because if we can stop these people from getting addicted to drugs,
Okay.
it's going to be a win for them.
Right. Okay.
If I can interrupt for a second, Bob.
Go ahead.
I'm just kind of curious as to what some of our local resources are for those who might be struggling with addiction or family members of someone struggling with addiction. Some of the organizations or steps they can take to try and get some help.
Sure, they got the HRS Center in Athens, and that's one of our
Now,
better.
now say that in real words. What is HR? That's jargon. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's a human resource center,
Human Resource Center.
and it's on Columbus Road, and that's a great place for somebody to go get it treated for any addiction. But they're very successful for treating opioids or any drug addiction.
Okay.
So a lot of times, like I said, we have the education, we have the enforcement, and through courts, they are sometimes court ordered to get treated and get counseling. And the success rate climbs if they want to help themselves and they're court ordered, and there's medications that can help us through this process. So HRS, the Vivitrol shots, and even
Right.
counseling when somebody's incarcerated in jail. And I really believe that they need counseling, they need help. So it's a long process. It's almost a lifetime struggle
Fine.
if somebody does get addicted to drugs, and they need to get the counseling and the help, medications, and it'll be a lifetime that they have to struggle with these addictions.
And some can cure themselves with cold turkey. Few do that.
Few do that. We see statistically the success rate. If they get counseling, they get help. Their success rate is much higher.
Yeah. Now, my father was addicted to Camel cigarettes, and he got cancer. So they gave him an operation, and they said, well, and they removed his what do they call it? They removed his prostate. Okay. No, they removed his intestine. And I said, well, if this comes back, it metastasized. And that means you're going to have to cut out your anus and you're going to have to wear a colostomy. Well, they cut out his anus and he had to wear a colostomy. And then it came back in 7 years. And then it spread to his kidney. And then it spread to a second kidney. And he finally died of kidney cancer at the age of 79. But he was diagnosed in 1959. So for 20 years, he gradually got off tobacco and got on to a cigar, and then he took one cigar at lunch, and finally he was an abstainer. But it took him a long time.
It took a long time, and sometimes it's too late. So
And that eventually killed him. Well, 79 is a pretty good age.
sure.
But he could, I'm 87. I've lived, what, 20 more years, and I'm still alive.
Yeah, shortened his life.
So abstention, and that's the best solution.
Well, if you want me to go through our process at the
ahead.
sheriff's office,
Go ahead.
like I said, we hit the 3 stages of education and enforcement, and our enforcement consists of, we have a what we call criminal interdiction unit,
Right.
and that consists of a deputy sheriff and a canine officer, and that's all they do.
Okay.
If we have areas in the county that's problematic, if they're suspected of drug usage, they work that area, and they've been pretty successful. They've actually in their enforcement, they've done over 300 felony indictments this year.
Good.
So the long-term investigation is done by our major crimes unit,
Good.
and they actually do the longer-term investigations, and it's a longer process. So they really target for the dealers.
Right.
So we try to get the dealers to reduce the amount of drugs that come into the county. The criminal interdiction guys, they are more short-term. If we have somebody that's suspected of dealing drugs and there's a lot of drugs activity coming in and out of the community, they target that, and they go try to get a traffic stop, and they use our canine for probable cause. So we've been pretty successful just trying to reduce the amount, so there's supply, and then we try to, whoever we can, we try to get them into some kind of drug treatment program. And to augment that, we have our first responders, our deputy sheriffs, and if you see our cars, the marked cruisers in Ohio, they're all the same. We got 88 counties, so we got these marked cruisers, and they're all the same throughout the state of Ohio.
Good.
So it's our version of the state police. So these
Good.
guys are always out 24 hours a day,
Right.
7 days a week, and they also help augment what the criminal interdiction unit do, and they also augment what the major crimes unit do, because what we do know is approximately 90% of all crimes lead back to drugs.
Good.
So once we attack our drug problem and we reduce the amount of drugs in our communities, it also goes hand in hand, it reduces the crime.
Good.
So the more drugs we can get out of our communities in Athens County, the more our crime goes down. So we've seen a reduction, not only in a little bit in drugs, we're never done,
Fine.
but we always try to fight, and we try to secure as many of those dealers, and we try to bring them to justice. We try to treat the addicts, because my thought is if you can treat someone that's addicted to drugs, you take them out of the equation. So if they're addicted to drugs, they always take drugs, we get them help and we get them better. It takes a burden off the jail system. And the person that wins most of all is their families, because what we see is an uprising in children's services where they're not taking care of their kids. If you got somebody that's addicted to drugs, they don't take care of their children, they're not working. So it solves so many problems, and that's why I'm a big advocate of helping people that's addicted.
I'm in favor of that.
If we can take them out of the equation, get them better, they're going to get a job, they're going to stay out of jail, it's going to be a better quality of life for their family.
Absolutely.
So, what I always say is it's not us against them, it's us trying to help the community. It's us working together
Fine.
with law enforcement in our communities. That's why we have so many community watch meetings.
Okay.
That's why I come to events like this, just so we can tell people that, we're all in this together. If we can make our community safer, and if we can get some drug dealers off the street, reduce the amount
All
of
right.
drugs,
Fine.
it will benefit everybody in this county.
Okay. I would like to raise the marijuana question.
Okay?
Do you think that marijuana is a gateway drug to harder stuff?
I do. Statistically, what you look at is people that do marijuana, and what they have is called a butane honey oil. So what they do, they take butane and they heat the THC from the marijuana to make it stronger.
Yeah.
And it's more dangerous than making meth. That's
Wow.
very explosive.
Wow.
So if somebody is doing the butane honey oil, and if you've ever seen us disassemble a meth lab, we have the fire department, and they're in their suits, and it's very dangerous. And any kind of a spark can launch an explosion. And the butane honey oil, which is a derivative of marijuana, which it makes it stronger, is even more dangerous than that.
Okay. Well,
So-
I think we have a duty to inform the Athens community. Vote no or yes on these marijuana petitions.
Well-
How should we vote?
I'm not a doctor. I'm not a physician. I don't know if medical marijuana is the answer. I don't know this.
Okay.
But what I do know is what I see and what I've been told by our narcotics officers, and they say, and I believe it's a gateway.
Right.
One of the dangers is if if that comes to light, you've got your black market drugs.
Right.
So if it's used like it's supposed to be used, it could be fine. But there again, you're going to have the people trying to melt down and get the higher THC and the bigger high from the marijuana.
Right.
And what we've seen in Athens County is the dealers that's selling marijuana is carrying weapons.
Oh, wow.
They're a little more violent than the people we see that's selling heroin.
Right.
So there's a lot more to this whole situation and what maybe a lot of people know.
Yes.
And, we could educate people a lot more on, the use of marijuana or the
Right.
derivatives that comes from marijuana.
Right.
So I'm not saying it shouldn't be legalized. I'm not a doctor. I don't know if medically it can
Well,
help you.
I take eye drops. We know that refined marijuana can cure, not cure, but stop glaucoma. Okay? So I take 2 drops
Sure.
at night and 2 drops in the morning. But they're highly rationed. I asked my doctor, I said, well, how much marijuana would I have to smoke to get a drop? He'd have to say, you'd have to smoke a joint every hour to make up that drop. So that's the question of dosage.
Sure.
That's a problem of enforcing the drug laws.
Well, yeah, again, like I said, you take a pain medication prescribed by a doctor is a good thing. You take a pain medication that's crushed and snorted, it's a bad thing.
Right.
You take medical marijuana, if a doctor prescribes it, says it's going to help an illness, it's a good thing. But if you have people selling on the black market,
Right.
it's a bad thing.
Yeah.
And if you got people that's mounting the butane honey oil, mounting those derivatives to make the THC stronger,
Right.
that's a bad thing because it's very explosive.
Right.
That butane, if it catches on fire, you've got a big bad explosion, and we've had cases where people's has made that around their families and around children.
Right. Now,
So-
I'd like to say something about morphine. I had an operation. I had a cancer operation. No, I had a prostate operation. My father had anus. I had a prostate operation in the Columbus Hospital. And I was in there 5 days. They gave me anesthesia. I was knocked out. I didn't feel anything. But when I woke up, I had terrible pains in my stomach because they stapled my stomach together. And they came around, the nurses came around, every 4 hours for a dose of morphine. And that's a local painkiller. But it was every 4 hours, no more. Every 4 hours, 24 hours a day. Okay. Well, I kept feeling kind of antsy after I didn't have a dose. And I was kind of welcoming that 4-hour thing. And then when I got the shot, I went right back to sleep. Well, I had to do that for 5 days. And then after 5 days, they said, well, we're going to release you from the hospital. And we're going to take away all of the marijuana. And you can go back home with a bag of urine. And the urine was dragging out. And I would walk around the bedroom and living room. I'd just walk around in circles. Didn't feel any pain. The morphine was gradually wearing off, see. But then I had to go back to the hospital to have the staples pulled out and get the final treatment. And they have a catheter. He said, okay, you hold your breath, and I'm going to yank this catheter out, and you're going to feel the worst pain you've ever felt before. And I just gritted my teeth, and it was over in a quarter of a second. And then I was released from the hospital and good. So morphine is a local anesthetic that will work. But the problem is that doctors and nurses in these hospitals steal the morphine and sell it on the black market. And that's how you get into cocaine and other kinds of addictions. Now you take cocaine. The Bolivian Indians living up in Bolivia used to chew the leaves. And that was a very mild narcotic. And they could pick potatoes and work in the cold weather on and on. But then somebody discovered you can take all of the leaves and refine that and make it into cocaine and export it to the stupid Americans, and they'll buy cocaine at high prices.
They will, and it is. You're right. It's a stimulant. You know, that's people that snort cocaine. It makes their heart race, and it speeds things up. Morphine and opiates, it's the opposite. You know, it tells your
Right.
brain's receptors, you know, you need to sleep. So each drug has its own little niche of what it does to the human body, and
Right.
you know, it's you know, people with cocaine, we see it a lot. They have a lot of heart problems, and it wears your heart out if you want to. You know, it enlarges your heart and it makes your heart beat faster, and it's a stimulant, and again, it'll shorten your lifespan. As of any drug that you take.
Right. So I've never had cocaine. I've never had marijuana. I was never drunk in my life. I was slightly high one day. It was during the Vietnam War, and I was debating. You know, the kids were out there with marijuana. I thought they were kids. I didn't touch it. But during the Vietnam War, I was debating with a political scientist. He was a hawk. He wanted to continue the Vietnam War. And I was a dove. So we went down to the campus and we debated this issue. Okay. So he had his PhD and he said, okay, well, let's go down and have a drink. And I said, wait, one drink is not going to bother me. So we go down to the what they call the downstairs restaurant. There's a restaurant that you just go down in the basement. That was the highest class bar in Court Street. It was called the downstairs. So only the faculty went there. The students were not allowed in there. Well, anyway, we go down there, and he says, well, what are you having? I said, well, I'm not much of a drinker. I'll take anything that you want. Well, he ordered a cocktail, vermouth. What do they call it? What's the famous cocktail? It's a mixture of vermouth and gin, and it's pure white. Has an Italian name. Anyway, martini. He said, let's have a martini. I'd never tasted martini in my life. So we had an olive in there, and I'm drinking this for about an hour, hoping that I'm now going to be able to walk out there. Okay. Well, and I was still sober. Okay. So then he says, hey, waiter, let's have another one. So he fills up that glass again. So then I play around with that for another hour. And then I get up, and I feel dizzy. I say, am I going to be able to get out of here without falling over? That was the first time and only time I was ever high. That was the closest point I ever got to getting. I was not. I didn't fall down the street.
Well, my experience.
2 minutes to go.
What's that?
He's saying we got 2 minutes to go.
Okay, my experience is I started my career as a correction officer, and I would see people with mind-altering drugs or drinking, and see their state of mind when they came in, and I saw them when they sobered up, and they're, you know, most of them are very nice people. Once they got that, either the drugs or alcohol in their system, so we do know it's mind-altering, and whether it be alcohol and or drugs. So that's just why I'm a big advocate of a lot of treatment, and if we can get those addicted people off of drugs, because a lot of good people are wasting their lives, a lot of good people are shortening their lives. So I'm committed to do what I can do to help anybody that's got drug or alcohol addictions to maybe get a better quality of life.
Well, I thank you for coming, and I believe that debate is the oxygen of democracy, and we have to keep the debate going on the problems of drug addiction in 50 states.
I agree. I agree.